long-lasting stressor events, they can evoke immune dysregulation by the release of the pituitary and adrenal hormones in our bloodstream. And which hormones are those? For example, the catecholamines, mostly known as adrenaline and noradrenaline, or the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, or cortisol, growth hormone, and prolactin. So all these are hormones together or separately. The levels of these hormones, they are all influenced by negative emotions, which will further disturb the quality and quantity of our immune responses. Physiological and immunological response can be studied in people who are experiencing distress-generating events. For example, a student taking an exam, or a spouse going through a divorce, or even more chronic stressors such as caring for a husband or a wife who has cancer, for example. These are all long-term stressors, and let us not forget also the stressor called burnout, which is defined by the pure manifestation of job strain or unemployment, isolation. And let's not forget here the long-term stressors that are caused by post-traumatic disorders. So literally, people who are facing post-traumatic disorders or symptoms of post-traumatic disorders, they can be also vulnerable to immune dysfunction. So what happens in the brain in such situations? Within the brain itself, apart from the major subdivisions, there are minor subcomponents that play a role in this process, like the caudate nucleus, for example. It's inside of the cerebral cortex, which, by the way, is a huge part of the brain that's about a square meter if you unfold it. It's amazing. And the caudate nucleus actually works not only in the planning, the execution of movements, but it also in the learning process, in memory, reward, motivation, emotion, and romantic interactions. Then you have the hippocampus. And one of the things the hippocampus does is to compare your model of the world as it unfolds with the model that you desire to be okay. And it keeps track on mismatches. So if it detects a mismatch, then it disinhibits emotional and motivational centers in your brain, and that is the beginning of your response to the unknown, to the uncertainty, to fear, such as events that our generation was recently exposed to, like the pandemics and all the inadequacies of this war in the Ukraine. So this is another paper recently published in Humanities and Social Science Communication. So it's a scientific magazine from the Nature Publishing Group, so also another reliable journal here. And the title of this research work is Anxiety, Gender, and Social Media Consumption Predict COVID-19 Emotional Distress. So this article is a quantitative analysis on the factors that contributed to increased emotional distress regarding the pandemics. The authors found in a sample of 948 participants during the early stages of the pandemic that social media consumption, among other factors, but social media is a significant predictor of increasing emotional distress. So the authors in this research, they sort of probed media consumption and general COVID-19 behaviors by asking participants which social media they used to get their COVID-19 news, such, for example, Facebook, Twitter, government resources, and television, etc. And how often they consumed the news, so they could rank the consumption of news in a scale of 1 to 5. And 5 would be a great deal. So the scientists evaluated here which individuals experienced the most distress in the early stages of the pandemic. So they found in this study that people high in anxiety, liberal-leaning, intolerant to uncertainty, they are the ones absorbing large amounts of COVID-19 media, mostly from Facebook and Twitter. So they are the most vulnerable to experiencing increased emotional distress. And they also found that the anxiety trait exerts the strongest influence on emotional distress and is almost 3 times more predictive than any other variable in this study. So what is particularly interesting in this study is the media platform by which information was collected as an instrument to influence distress levels. Government media sources did not contribute to emotional distress at all, but social network platforms such as Facebook and Twitter and also television watching were linked with higher emotional distress levels. So another article also that I want to highlight here, actually, it was published in the journal Science Advances. The title of this research is Media Exposure to Mass Violence Events Can Fuel a Cycle of Distress. this is a very interesting one. The fundamental findings of this research is that distress response to large-scale traumas, such as, for example, terror attacks or bombing and war, may sensitize some individuals to media coverage of collective tragedies, which empowers a cycle of distress. So the findings of this research suggest that exposure to repeated trauma-related media coverage may lead some individuals to become more vulnerable to mental health consequences. This cycle of sensitivity to distress may also contribute to a prolonged physiological stress response that increases the risk for stress-related diseases. Acute stress response following a terror attack have also been associated with an increased incidence of cardiovascular diseases over time, even among individuals who were not directly exposed to the attack. So, this cycle of media exposure and distress appears to have a downstream implication to public health, and we need to be aware of this. You need to be diligent and careful with the level of media exposure or media consumption that you have. So instead of having an immediate response to uncertainty by going to social media and engaging in negativity with a low capacity to use, for example, a vocabulary that represents cognition of the problem, but rather a self-sustaining growth in reading and writing anxiety-provoking texts, maybe a better attitude would be trying to do something else, like just talking about something else or watching a show, for example, or trying to be distracted with other things. And even if your impulsive desires are driving you towards the news or to talk constantly about the same problem, just pose the question to yourself. Is it really effective? What's my circle of influence? What I can really impact? This has a lot to do with personality, actually. The contagious capacity of social media is maximized amongst people that are temperamentally susceptible or easily manipulated, which is a feature that is highly associated with a high openness personality trait. And as described by Donald Wislow-Fiske, the big 5 broad personality traits, which are extroversion, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. So people who tend to be high in the trait of openness, they are more willing to embrace new things, fresh ideas, and novel experiences. So for someone that is high in openness, it is often hard for this person to catalyze and specify an identity. And he or she is more diverse in his or her inner life, including emotional life. This is a form of problem avoidance. You avoid what is toxic to you, right? You don't need to access negative news every day, especially because news, it is only important today. And highly likely that is not as important tomorrow. Perhaps by the end of the week, have access to a summary of what's happening and what is absolutely relevant you keep with. And the more you expose yourself to that, it will affect the structure of your emotions. So that will bring cumulative damage to your nervous system and also gradually and programmatically affect your physical and mental health. It doesn't mean that you're completely avoiding the problem, but you also get you get the information, but you don't get the problem or the poison every day. I hope that this podcast could help you to better understand many aspects of our biology that by itself might already impact and reduce fear to the unknown, and also to provide you with the tools that can really help you to reduce the impact of negative emotions on different circumstances that normally have a negative aspect on our health, particularly to our immunity, and its consequence also to infection and chronic disease, such as cancer. If you are not already following Medical Science Reviews on Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, please do so to support our initiative. And we also have a homepage, by the way. It's medicalsciencereviews.com, where I'm hosting most of the podcasts and also expanding the interconnected social links. So I teach in Instagram, I teach immunology together with YouTube, where I also post immunology courses and the podcast content. And also bringing some short clips about health-related topics sometimes, but not always overlapping with the content of the podcast. Thank you for your interest in medical sciences.